This podcast is brought to you by Osprey Approach. In conveyancing, fixed fees mean every minute counts. Too much admin eats into your profits, and inefficiencies slow transactions down. Osprey Approach is a legal software built for law firms, helping conveyancers stay in control by managing cases, accounts, documents, and compliance all in one place. From automated client updates to post-completion workflows, Osprey streamlines every step, cutting admin time and keeping transactions moving. Osprey Approach. We make running a law firm easier.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today we're talking all about fraud, ID fraud, deep fakes, artificial intelligence, the list goes on. Gavin Burton, the co-founder and a trainer at Beruku Knowledge, knows much more about this than I do and is going to impart some of his wisdom today in the course of the discussion. Thank you for joining the podcast, Gavin.
Thanks, David.
In the first instance, tell us about yourself, because you've got a very, very interesting background.
Yeah, so I joined the Metropolitan Police when I was 17 years old as a cadet and stayed there for another 26 years and retired as a detective sergeant. And I had a really good role towards the back end of my career where I had a team where we were dedicated towards ID fraud, and it was the only one in law enforcement. And we would go out with the National Crime Agency and Immigration Service and get hard drives from counterfeiters and extract all the data and have information sharing agreements with lots of people within government and private sector, all to do with preventing fraud and protecting vulnerable adults and children, really. And within that, myself and a number of other officers got trained by the National Document Fraud Unit in examining ID documents. Basically, we were seeing hundreds and hundreds of false ID documents a day, purely because of these counterfeiters. I left the Met Police around about 2016, and since then I've worked for various different identity verification companies in their kind of fraud area, the counter fraud area. And for the last few years, I've been co-founder and lead trainer with Beruku Knowledge.
I think people forget, I was going to say people, perhaps lawyers don't forget this because it's very much on their radar, but it's easy to forget that money laundering regulations apply to the whole of law, not just any one area. Conveyancing is particularly acute as an example because of the scale of fraud there, but it's as relevant to wills and probate and family and company commercial as it is anywhere. Can you give us some insight into the scale of fraud and fraudulent ID in the UK? My suspicion is that I think we're probably a little naive to this.
There's a recent report that came out from CIFAS called Fraudscape, and it had an increase in ID fraud. I mean, there is general identity fraud where you can hijack another person's identity, but in terms of like ID document fraud, that's when you're really talking about these little black books, these passports here and driving licenses and stuff like, where you can recreate them from scratch, counterfeit documents, or you can alter them, or there's a big market for lost and stolen documents as well. It's a pretty big problem. It's always been there ever since we've had documents, and ID is really an enabler of lots of different types of crimes or different things that we have to do in our day-to-day life. And like you say, with the money laundering regs, it's very rare these days to have somebody that doesn't have a bank account or needs to transfer money in one form or another, or has to verify their identity in one form or another. In terms of the scale of the problem, like I said, huge. I mean, we did a little exercise where we were looking at documents that were being advertised for sale through social media channels, and we managed to find, it's over 6,100 documents that had people's details on it. I mean, you're talking residence permits for the EU, driving licenses, passports, blank visas that just need personalisation. And there's also lots and lots of of clearly genuine documents that are being used as a kind of a front on some of these profiles to sell documents. I always say that I'm a pretty standard, generic looking 50-plus-year-old male with bald hair. And I could probably pass for somebody of a very similar kind of appearance. So that's why there's a big trading in lost and stolen documents as well. So it's really, really important that if you do lose or have your documents stolen, you need to report it as such. But the scale is huge, but very hard to put your finger on. It's like kind of Donald Rumsfeld unknown knowns almost of fraud.
But readily available, as you say, you can go onto social media and presumably you don't have to do a lot of digging to find some of this.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. And, there are other kind of channels where you can go through that are advertising. I mean, if you are somebody looking for a false ID document, you're really taking your chance going on social media, because there may well be lots of social media profiles out there that are selling these or advertising the sale of these. But a lot of them also are probably scams as well, that are just scraping kind of like the videos and the images of these false documents and saying, yeah, we can provide you with a driving license or whatever. If you lose your money and you all of a sudden you've given up all your personal information as well in the process, you're not exactly going to be running to the police to say, I've been scammed online, when your whole purpose was to get a false ID document in the first place. And that's a real big problem with younger people who want to get a false ID to get through a pub at Christmas time, for example. There are these lots of different areas where ID fraud and fraudulent documents have an impact. We mentioned conveyancing earlier. It's not just that. It's like I say, young kids trying to get a false ID to get into a pub, and actually giving up your genuine identity to somebody who's making false documents. Essentially, you're putting your own identity at risk of fraud for a long time to come beyond that.
What are the challenges from a law enforcement point of view with identifying the people that sit behind these social accounts or WhatsApp channels or wherever it is that they're advertising?
What we can see is that people are clearly communicating through end-to-end encrypted messaging services. So that's always going to be a problem or difficult to investigate, let's say. When I think back to my days in the police, counterfeiters would generally have runners from the counterfeiting factory to a local cafe to deliver the documents, and the orders used to be on little order forms. I want a British driving license with this date of birth, and here's a photograph of my portrait, for example, that's going to be on the document. But end-to-end encrypted messaging services have made that a lot easier for the counterfeiter in the whole operation. So it makes it far more challenging for law enforcement to investigate. The other thing is as well, certainly when you're talking about social media channels, there's cross-border jurisdictional issues, whether we've got very specific law in the UK around false ID and using a false identity for kind of a nefarious purpose, as it were. But that might not necessarily be the case in another country. They may have different laws, and they may not deem it serious enough to do investigations on behalf of UK law enforcement and vice versa, for example. It is very, very challenging. And I think technology today makes it far more challenging, because you need a higher degree of experience and skill from police officers or law enforcement to investigate that.
On the flip side of that technology point, though, and again, this is perhaps a little bit naivety on my part, presumably, rightly or wrongly, these documents are now much more difficult to counterfeit. I mean, if you think about your passport, for example, these days has got a chip in it, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Is that making it more difficult for counterfeiters to produce these documents, or are they just looking at other avenues that are easier, but perhaps at least resistance?
Yeah, to a certain extent, it's making it more difficult. But as technology advances, so do counterfeiter skills. There was a recent ID document factory that was busted by the Kosovan police in Kosovo, January, February time, and they recovered 20,000 chips that could be pre-programmed and put into false documents. With modern day documents like this, you see that little biometric chip symbol there, it means it's got a chip in it. The chip from a genuine issuing country will have a cryptographic signing certificate, that proves that it's been issued from the correct issuing authority. HMPO, for example, for British passports, let's say. Counterfeiters, what we have seen is that they are encoding chips and encoding parts of the data groups that contain all your personal information, the portrait, and it looks like it's opening, but actually it's just copying what a genuine chip will do, but it won't have that cryptographic feature that verifies that it's actually from the correct issuing authority. So that's getting a little bit technical. In terms of documents in general, we've gone away from counterfeiters cutting the back of a page out, removing a photograph and putting a new one in, for example, because we've got so many polycarbonate documents that are far more secure, and you can have more security features in these things. But what we see is counterfeiters adapting to that by kind of trying to abrade portraits out and printing over, or actually importing polycarbonate cards in from abroad and then personalizing them with lasers. I mean, back in my day in the police, counterfeiters had big kind of like tower computers, and the graphic design software was hundreds of pounds, and you needed an awful lot of skill to use it. Now I can download Photoshop onto an iPad, and I can do it at the touch of a fingertip. And you've got things like AI that helps with the kind of like the blending of background patterns and stuff like that, genuinely for Photoshop. It's a genuine use, but actually it can be used in a different way.
What are the most commonly copied or spoofed documents? I know you've got a wonderful stat about one of the most popular ones as well.
From what we looked at online, just taking passports and driving licenses, because you are looking at online profiles that are UK based, you're going to have UK passports and UK driving licenses that come out top every time. Now that could be different if you're in a different country. For example, if you're in France, it's probably French passports and French driving licenses. But what we did find is that there were some really interesting things that were in there in terms of, let's say, countries that you wouldn't ordinarily come across. And one of the top passports that we started to see were passports from St. Kitts and Nevis. And you think, well, tiny little island out in the Caribbean somewhere, why? We've got people from various different places of the world all on St. Kitts and Nevis passports. Well, is that a money laundering thing? It's typical identity. You answer one question and about another three prop up. This could be a money laundering problem in terms of, well, I'm going to go to somewhere that might have some more kind of like opaque laws around AML, or it could be an immigration reason why that person has got that document. Can they enter another country via St. Kitts and Nevis, for example, in an easier way than they could if they had, for instance, a Chinese passport, just off the top of my head? And a third reason could well be human trafficking. You've got somebody that's given the promise, handed over lots of money for the promise of a job, and they get given this document, they think it's for real, and all of a sudden they're in some kind of enforced environment where they're a slave in effect. So there could be lots and lots of reasons. But one thing that I do always say is that, and I said it right at the beginning, identity is an enabler of other crime. It's really hard to live off the grid now. Most people are connected technologically in some way with other people, whether it's through a computer or a phone or whatever. But actually you need to verify your identity in so many different environments and for so many different reasons that it's not just a KYC thing now. You need to do it if you want to rent a property, or if you go for a job, or if for various different reasons that you will need to verify your identity and provide either copies of your identity document or have it looked at by someone in some form.
The second half.
Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
If you like, of the discussion, if the first half, Gavin, is about fraudulent ID, what it looks like, how it manifests, that kind of thing. I want to contextualize it now for practitioners and kind of the impact of them in their daily lives, because you identified that you worked for a number of these ID providers, for example. I don't know how many listeners will realize that whilst these ID providers have got very tech-enabled processes, at some point, once those are exhausted, it still goes to somebody to eyeball the actual physical document, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. In a lot of circumstances, it does. I mean, I would always advise that if you are looking at your business and verifying identity in some way, to utilize technology. The power of technology in ID verification is huge, and there are so many good companies out there doing good things. But there are circumstances where somebody may drop out of that whole workflow of producing their document, having it scanned, taking a photo, whatever. Chips within documents, for example. Sometimes, yes, if you're going to verify a chip, it's a really good standard of verification. It's a very high standard of verification. But sometimes chips get corrupted, sometimes they break. Dependent upon what mobile phone that you're using, you might get timed out of a process and you might fall between the cracks, let's say. And if you fall out or drop out of the process, then there are a lot of companies out there that do have human help desks that image of that document or that document will go to. And they generally have very, very experienced people on their help desk looking at documents and will very quickly be able to make a decision around whether that is an image of a genuine document or not.
There was a period of time where the machine readable zone on a document was sort of a fairly foolproof way of verifying ID. As I understand it, that algorithm has been cracked, if you like, and people can create machine readable zones with those numbers and the combination of numbers and letters that will beat the system.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the machine readable zone on a travel document is all around ensuring that you can travel from one country to the next, and your document is being scanned and verified in a standardized international way. As a result, the people who govern all those rules, organisation called ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, they've got a big manual that deals with all the specs of all travel documents, and that algorithm is within that document. So it's easy to obtain, it's easy to break, it's easy to work out. Checking on a machine readable zone in itself is fairly low in terms of security than actually checking various different parts of a document and also the chip, for example, or applying an AI-based solution that verifies that certain features on a document should be in a certain position and a certain clarity, for example. So, that information has been out there from day dot since the internet has basically been around, and since the machine readable zone has been invented, really. So whilst it is a check, we still see counterfeiters that get it wrong, because quite often counterfeiters will be under pressure to churn out documents, so they'll put in any old number and won't really make the effort to work out the algorithm and the correct check digits within that. Yeah, if you've got a really good counterfeiter who's going to create a really good high quality document or a really high quality image of a document, then the MRZ, the machine readable zone, that is something that should be their bread and butter as a counterfeiter to get right, in comparison to lots and lots of other features on a document.
It's important to say here that the technology that the ID providers utilize has developed massively as well over the course of the last couple of years. So you're advocating that as a route because the counterfeiters are very good, ergo the checks that have to be done have to be even better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you've now got ID providers that are not just doing an MRZ anymore. They're using artificial intelligence to actually plot where a particular feature should be on a document or how a particular font should be used. So yes, it is a bit of an arms race, but it will be really interesting to see in the next couple of years where technology goes with artificial intelligence, because you can go online and find these document generation sites where you can just type in your details and it would generate almost like a staged photograph of a passport with your image, all your data, and it will have the MRZ encoded correctly. So there are all these battles with identifying what a deepfake is and what a document that would come out of a document generator would be, whilst also utilising AI in a good way to verify that document as well.
And just to come back to the sort of the impact on the lawyer here, what are the expectations on them as far as you understand from the regulations and from their responsibilities under money laundering? Because the pushback here is, with the greatest of respect, Gavin, you're the expert in verifying documentation. I'm a lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at AML regs, you've got to verify that person's identity. You've got your source of funds. Now, I'm not an expert on source of funds, and you've also got to assess the risk. When I say about identity, clearly you've got identity documents, but there are also other secondary documents that will support a person's identity and verify potentially where they live, how long they've been at an address for, etc., etc. In terms of risk, I would always look at things like risk assessments and say, well, actually, because identity is so key to AML here, looking at how you deal with identity within a wider risk assessment. Are our people trained? Do they know what the current threat market is like in terms of identity, for example? Do we use technology? Do we use technology in the right way in how we need to use it? And actually, whether you're a lawyer whether it's something to do with probate or whether it's something to do with conveyancing, it may well be that your risk profile is slightly different in terms of documents that you're seeing as well. It may well be, actually, we have a particular difficulty with documents coming in from a particular region in the world, for example. Do we need extra help to address that risk? Do we need to bringing more technology that will, for example, validate what a utility bill is from Mauritius, for example? Do you see what I mean? I mean, secondary documents are an absolute minefield for lawyers and, well, for anybody really, because they do not conform to set international standards like ID documents. But there are solutions and technical solutions that can identify some of these secondary documents and give you kind of like a risk assessment on whether you've got a good one or a bad one, or whether one's been generated from a document generation site or it's a deep fake, for example. So just to digress slightly, there's been something on LinkedIn just recently about fake receipts that people have posted. So you can go onto ChatGPT images and you can generate a receipt. For example, like, I can just put in Marco's Pizza restaurant or whatever it is in some address in London, generate me a background, make sure it's crunched up a little bit to make it look good, and for this value with a GB VAT number. And then all of a sudden you're starting to generate lots and lots of receipts. Now, if you go on to ChatGPT images, it restricts you from actually producing ID documents and things like utility bills. It's built in. It's like responsible AI, for example. But as we've seen with the receipts issue, there's always a workaround somewhere. And if you're a fraudster, you're always going to try and find a gap in the process somewhere.
We've alluded to it in the course of the discussion, but one of the things I always take away from conversations like this is that the criminal is usually bloody smart. We can sort of sit here and think to ourselves, we're pretty intelligent people. Generally speaking, criminals are smarter because, as you say, they're always looking for that work around the system, and that should never be anything that we should forget. Just to finish off, tell us a little bit about your work with professionals, with lawyers, how you work alongside them to help them, and then we'll move to a close.
So it would really be around awareness training, really. I cannot stress the importance, really, of being aware to the dangers of ID crime and ID fraud and counterfeiting and how it's adapting, because it's not something that's static. It's not something that, it's just, like I say, taking the photograph out the back of a passport page, for example, that it was 20 years ago. It's evolved and the threat has evolved. And if you don't understand the threat that's being posed to you, then you're not going to be able to make an informed assessment of what your actual risk is. I would really say that and stress from the legal sector that technology is great from the physical verification of documents, but actually staff need to be made aware of the fact that there are bad guys out there, and this is currently what they're doing. And like I say, with AI, things have evolved absolutely, stratospheric like that rapidly. So it's really, really important.
Well, if that's not a message that firms should be listening to, then can I remind them that in the last few weeks, in the last few months, in fact, and we're talking in April at the moment, that the SRA have levied well in excess of £100,000 worth of fines on law firms for anti-money laundering failures. So between what you're saying, Gavin, and perhaps what the regulators are saying, firms will sit up and pay attention. Thank you so much for joining the discussion. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to you, Gavin. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.